Between realism of the early 19th century and naturalism of the late 19th century, a new movement emerged in the mid-19th century, which, though short-lived, would go on to influence major artists like Charles Baudelaire, Gerard Hopkins, and even early modernists like W.B. Yeats. By the mid-19th century, particularly between 1849 to 1854, a new movement had arisen in England. This was a 7-member group of poets, artists, and critics that was formed in response to the Royal Academy. This was the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. They found the Royal Academy to be shallow and uninspired, and so the Brotherhood was formed by 3 Royal Academy students, William Hunt, John Millais, and Dante Rossetti. The Brotherhood first appeared in 1849 at London's Royal Academy and Free Exhibition show. The 3 men signed their paintings with both their signatures and their acronym PRB. They drew their inspiration from 14th and 15th century Italian art. They believed in a more spiritual, realistic approach to art, and took issue with the classical style popularized by Raphael, thus the name Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. If you look at the characteristics of this movement, their paintings had almost photorealistic accuracy, with lively color palettes. And they encouraged the pursuit of all art, not just certain fields. They maintained that art is all-encompassing and that artists should pursue a variety of forms, whether it be painting, poetry, or literature. But this was a short-lived movement, because by 1854, the Brotherhood had disbanded. The artists went their separate way. But although it was short-lived, the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood's ideas and members had a lasting impact. It had a direct influence on the art and craft movement, and an indirect influence on the Decadence Movement. The art and craft movement was similar to the Art Nouveau movement, except that the Art Nouveau movement used industrial materials like iron. It was a 19th century movement that first flourished in England, and that spread internationally. In Japan, it emerged in the 1920s as the Mingei movement. It believed that objects must be well-made, useful, and decorative. The Decadence Movement was a 19th century movement that first flourished in France, and then spread throughout Europe and to the United States. It followed an aesthetic ideology of excess, that is hedonism, and artificiality, that is human fantasy. The Decadence Movement rose against realism and naturalism. The writers distanced themselves from the social concerns and objective styles of realism and naturalism, which focused on portraying everyday life of ordinary people. Instead, decadence pursued introspection, imagination, and aesthetic exploration. So they were closer to the Romantics than they were to the Realists. In the 1950s, when the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood was born, another movement was born in France in the mid-19th century during the 1850s and 1860s. This was known as the French Parnassian poetry, a group of poets who valued precision, objectivity, and restraint in their works. The term Parnassian derives from Mount Parnassus, a symbol of poetry and arts in Greek mythology. But the movement derived its name from its consolidated publication of the anthology Le Parnasse Contemporain, edited by Alphonse Lemaire. Just like realism, it also began as a reaction against the emotional excess and subjectivity of Romanticism. If we look at the characteristics of Parnassian poetry, 1. Objectivity, having an impersonal tone. 2. Classical themes and classical mythology. 3. Exoticism, exploration of distant, exotic lands and cultures. 4. Technical perfection, emphasis on precise form, meter, and rhyme. 5. Visual imagery, strong focus on descriptive and vivid imagery to evoke scenes and emotions indirectly. The most influential poets of the French Parnassian poetry were Théophile Gautier and Charles Leconte. The influence of French Parnassian poetry began to permeate English literature in the 1870s, with poets like Swinburne and Andrew Lang drawing inspiration from their French contemporaries. Some believe the British Parnassian poetry to be an earlier phase of aestheticism. Aestheticism is a literary movement that values beauty and the pursuit of pleasure over other artistic elements. The characteristic of aestheticism is art for art's sake, that is, art should be created for its own sake and not teach a lesson or perform a social function. Subjective beauty, that is, beauty is a subjective experience. Evaluating art based on its own criteria, that is, art should be judged on its own merits, not by its morality or utility. The major writers in their aestheticism were Oscar Wilde and Walter Pater. Within the late 19th century also came Impressionism. Impressionism is a style that focuses on capturing a character's fleeting thoughts, feelings, and sensory impressions, rather than providing detailed descriptions of events or settings. The characteristics of Impressionism are 1. Showing subjective experience of reality using vivid imagery and fragmented narratives. 2. Story is told from perspective of character, that is, the first-person perspective. 3. The author uses sensory details to create an impression of a scene or a moment. 4. The writing is often vague or ambiguous, leaving the reader to interpret the story's meaning. The important writers under Impressionism would be Joseph Conrad and Virginia Woolf. Late 19th century also saw the emergence of symbolism. Symbolism is an extension of the aesthetic movement. Symbolism was a literary and artistic movement that sought to express individual emotional experience through the subtle and suggestive use of highly symbolized language. Symbolism is a literary movement that centered mostly around the work of poets such as Stéphane Mallarmé, Arthur Rimbaud, and Paul Verlaine. The term symbolist was coined by Jean Morier in the review La Vogue in 1886. Charles Baudelaire, known as the founder of French symbolism, though not himself a part of the movement, expressed a modernistic vision of the sordidness, sensuality, and corruption of city life. Baudelaire's infamous collection of poems, Les Fleurs du Mal, The Flowers of Evil, in 1857, became the subject of an obscenity trial for including lesbian poems. Baudelaire was a believer in original sin and viewed the modern world as fallen. In his Journal Intime, he stated that man is naturally depraved, and he ridiculed the idea of progress, viewing commerce as in its very essence satanic. Symbolism is not just restricted to symbols per se. Instead, it attempted to raise language to expression, as opposed to explicit communication of ideas. You will see a hint of the formalists in this movement, because its chief poet, Stéphane Mallarmé, described the language of symbolism as to paint not the thing but the effect it produces. So expression of a poetic idea was through an effective language rather than through straightforward communication of information. The characteristics of symbolist literature would then be 1. They focus on language's form rather than its communicative aspects. They believed that language performs a communication with ready-made meanings, whereas symbolist language brings out the full potential of language. 2. They focus on the musicality of language and rhyme. 3. The symbolists focus on technical and artificial nature of artistic production, which was utilized by T.S. Eliot in his notion of tradition and objective correlative. 4. The main tool that the symbolists use was synesthesia, which is a neurological experience where two or more senses are combined and experienced together. Synesthesia is drawn on Baudelaire's notion of correspondences between the senses. They drew on Platonic philosophy, which is, the present world is an imperfect reflection of a higher, infinite, and eternal realm which could be evoked by symbols. Hence, they rejected the descriptive language of the realists and naturalists in favor of a more suggestive, symbolic, and all-elusive language that could evoke states of consciousness. The tension between innovation and tradition goes hand in hand when it comes to the symbolists. An important debate about symbolism occurred between Marcel Proust and Mallarmé in 1896. Proust wanted language to have a clarity of vision, as opposed to obscure images and ideas. Mallarmé argued that language itself is the image. Another tension you'll see between Rimbaud and Mallarmé is Rimbaud's concept of dissonance, which conveys the derangement of the senses through irregular use of verse forms, dissonant sounds, and clashing images. This was in contrast with Mallarmé, who was a strong innovator of traditional forms such as the sonnet. So what are the characteristics of the Decadence movement? Well, the characteristics of aestheticism, impressionism, as well as symbolism. All of these characteristics are characteristics of the Decadence movement. All these movements that emerged in the 19th century, realism, naturalism, the Decadence movement, all of these eventually gave way to modernism in the early 20th century. Perhaps not surprisingly, modernism would claim to be more real than realism. The artist Georgia O'Keeffe said nothing is less real than realism. Details are confusing. It is only by selection, by elimination, by emphasis, that we get at the real meaning of things. Thus, she preferred abstract art as a way to arrive at a more complete image of truth. If you're interested in knowing more about modernism, check out this lecture. I've also curated a playlist for modernist writers and poets. You can find that here.